In Act 2, Scene 2 of The Merry Wives of Windsor, Frank Ford says, "I will rather trust a Fleming with my butter, Parson Hugh the Welshman with my cheese, an Irishman with my aqua-vitae bottle, or a thief to walk my ambling gelding than my wife with herself." Why do certain nationalities have close associations with certain foods? And what does this tell us about early modern English attitudes to foreigners? Was this something common across all strata of society? One of the ways to explore these attitudes is to look at how foreigners are represented in plays, particularly when it comes to food. So, for that reason, I spoke to food historian and fellow podcaster Sam Bilton about this. Sam has recently released a cookbook called Much Ado About Cooking, which looks at the food references in Shakespeare's plays, and it comes with a ton of delicious recipes. Hello, this is the Delicious Legacy Podcast. I'm your greedy and curious archaeogastronomer, Tom Dinas, and I welcome you to my smoky, steamy, and heavily perfumed with spices kitchen. Another adventure through food and history beckons. Happy New Year to all, and thanks for joining me once more. Remember to leave a review and a rating for the podcast, because every little helps to push the podcast up in people's feeds and upwards on the charts as well. So do leave a rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Pocket Casts, and please put a nice review with 5 stars preferably on Apple Podcasts. I would like to thank my brand new Patreon backers, Stefan, Adi, Fixed Star Energy, Wallace R, Mar B, Michelle Lind, Maria Sanchez Carlo, Bureau of Lost Culture, Andy Grant, Clara Viret, Irene Dels, Helenka Kinan, Elke, and Ian Mason. And of course, an extended thank you from the bottom of my heart to all the current, existing, old Patreon members who've been supporting this podcast for some time now. Your support means the world to me, and you help me and you encourage me to create this little project of mine. Pies are always in my mind. I can't lie. I'm sure the British nation is behind me on this one. Hearty fillings, chunky cuts of meat and veg in a rich gravy encased in delicious pastry is essentially a warm, wholesome hug on a cold, cold winter's night, just like this one tonight. It won't surprise you to know that in Shakespeare's time and in Elizabethan England, pies were starting to take off as a portable, delicious meal, hot or cold. Early pies were also made for feasts, with the inedible pastry casing elaborately decorated. Of course, over the course of the centuries, these have evolved a lot, and back then there were mostly inedible cases called coffins surrounding and protecting the delicate fillings. It was around the 16th century that the pie crust started to be food as well. Roasted expertly on the spit next to a roaring fire and served at noble feasts. The capon, that's a castrated rooster as we call it in modern times, was prized for its tenderness and rich flavour. The capon was one of the most luxurious poultry options available in Shakespeare's England, while today the word, and indeed the food itself, may be unknown to many, and a case in point, many of my friends and English family. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the capon was a delicacy, frequently mentioned in early modern literature, including a dozen times across Shakespeare's plays. For many reasons, castrated roosters are not a common fare today, but in Shakespeare's England, the capon was definitely a fancy delicacy. Revered for its tender texture, rich flavour and the balanced humours, the capon was a luxury poultry dish served at noble banquets and recommended by early modern physicians for the sick and the elderly. The prevalent Galenic theory of humours was still in use to a great extent and had a bearing on one's diet, and indeed mainly on the aristocratic and higher classes. As I mentioned, Earlier, capons appear in over a dozen of Shakespeare's plays, including As You Like It and All's Well That Ends Well. Most likely, they are a symbol of wealth, comfort, or a full life. The origin of the word capon comes from the Latin word caponem, meaning cockerel or rooster, as we say that now, that has been neutered or castrated to improve the quality of the meat. Capons are usually born around March and are castrated towards the end of August in order to reach their peak weight and taste for the festive period. Nowadays, if that obviously happens, it's not very common. It's something that considered a little bit iffy for animal welfare reasons. So these were two of the important and interesting and delicious things from early modern period. But let's go to my guest, Sam Bilton, the author of the book Much Ado About Cooking, and find out a lot more about the foods from Shakespeare's plays. Sam, hello.
Hello.
Welcome to the Delicious Legacy Podcast.
Nice to be back.
Yes. And I think we're going to talk about something familiar to you. Have you?
Yes, indeed.
So, tell me about the book a little bit.
Okay, so Much Ado About Cooking is, as it says on the front cover, delicious Shakespearean feast for every occasion. It's a cookbook, essentially, but all the recipes are based on early modern sources, although they're modern interpretations. But more importantly, they're inspired by quotes relating to food in his plays. There's a lot of food in Shakespeare's plays, a lot of food, which people don't realise until you start reading it, and then you actually realise that Yeah.
The moment you start reading it with that in mind, you actually see all the references. I think when you just watch the plays and stuff, you just skip it because it's everyday thing. It's normal, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing, isn't it? I mean, we all have to eat, and it doesn't matter whether we're, rich or poor. Everyone has to have some kind of sustenance. I mean, obviously, poor people, especially back then, didn't always get that sustenance. But it's something that we can all relate to. Although I suspect some of the references go over modern theatregoers' heads these days because
True.
of foods we're not familiar with, or the way it's phrased is not something we're familiar with, or the cooking methods are not things we're familiar with. But yeah, it's something that's very relatable. And it actually makes Shakespeare, very interesting. Obviously, I'd say that I'm a food historian, but also I think it makes it more relatable in many ways when you do sort of catch the meaning. And you don't have to be a food historian to understand the food references. Some of them are more obvious than others.
Great. So on today's Delicious Legacy episode, we are having a little bit of a twist. We're talking about food and foreigners in the early modern period, looking at that through the eyes of Shakespeare and your book.
Yeah. I mean, it's something, again, that I don't think you would necessarily, I don't know, I guess Shakespearean scholars would probably disagree with me there, but I'm not a Shakespearean scholar, I'm an expert in food history.
Yeah.
Well, I like to think I'm an expert in food history. But I think, the way that different nationalities are portrayed in the plays is quite telling. Quite often these depictions are connected to food in some way, which is also fascinating.
But I want to ask you firstly, and you have to answer this, which recipe from the book is your favorite recipe? Which one you would do without batting an eyelid?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Everyone always asks me this, and it doesn't matter which book I've written. And it is a bit like picking a favourite child.
Yes.
And so if my children are listening, I don't have a favourite child. I only have two. I love you both equally. When it comes to recipes, I guess it depends what I'm in the mood for.
Yeah.
But and also the season. I mean, one thing you can say about early modern cooking, really cooking up until the 20th century, is it's all very seasonal. So there's a recipe in the book for a chicken. I think originally it would have been a capon, but we can't get capons these days. Cooked with oranges and lemons, but oranges back then were the sour, Seville oranges.
Yeah.
So it's still a hugely seasonal dish in this country because we tend to only get Seville oranges in January. I don't even think you can get them in December
Absolutely.
easily. I'm sure there's some places, maybe in London, you can. I live out in the sticks by comparison, so we definitely can't get Seville oranges in December, but certainly January through February, they come into season, and it's a beautiful, they're very aromatic, and it really does. You can make it with lemons and it's lovely, but if you use the Seville oranges, it's just a beautiful dish and a slightly different twist on a roast chicken. So that's one of my favourites. And then I also like the shortbread or shortcake recipe in there, which was surprising because actually you read it and it sounds surprisingly modern. It's the it's made with clotted cream rather than butter. And it's one of the few recipes, or not one of the few, I mean, quite a lot of the recipes I didn't have to change too much apart from altering measurements and terminology and scaling them down. But that one in particular is pretty much as it is in the original 16th century sauce.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was counting on that. I was counting you telling me basically about the seasonality of the food. So I was thinking about you're going to find a recipe that is going to be particularly relevant now because it's winter. And for me, I think without hesitation, I would go to the pork pie, to that nice pork and herb pie basically that you have on the book.
Yeah, I mean, the pies were a joy to make. And I actually did go on a pie course run by Ivan Day before he retired from doing them at the School of Artisan Foods. And he is an absolute pie master.
Yes.
Compared to me, I have to admit, my pies are most definitely very achievable because I've made them in my kitchen. And you don't need fancy moulds or anything. But yeah, the pies, I mean, they loved a pie in this era. Not just because you could put lovely, delicious things in pies, but of course, it was kind of a way of preserving food. So you could put like whole birds and stuff in pies and seal them. And in theory, they kept fresh. I still struggle with the concept because obviously growing up in an age where we have refrigeration and we're constantly told, we've both worked in hospitality. We're constantly told about the food hygiene stuff and, don't keep stuff out of the fridge for X number of hours or whatever, and then it has to be binned. So there is that part of me, the modern part of me that goes, I think I always say to people, keep it in the fridge. Don't put the old, it will keep for months and end, theory to the test because they didn't have centrally heated houses.
No, they didn't.
Shakespeare's day.
Yeah, and they had ladders. They had cold rooms. They had places, and they had the storage was adjusted to reflect that. Basically, you had the room that it was cold enough. You would have things hanging in suspended baskets, so they would be aired from every side. So these things matter. We can't have those in our modern kitchens, in our modern houses.
No.
And another last question that puts you on the spot. Where would you like to live in Tudor England? Would you like to live in London or in Stratford-upon-Avon?
Well, I think, again, that would depend on your financial situation, wouldn't it? I mean, London was a lot smaller than it is now. Yeah. So, like, where you live in London was probably open countryside.
The sticks, yes, It was.
Like where I live. Well, actually, I don't live, to be fair, I should clarify, I don't literally live in the sticks. I live on a commuter belt, so I can get into London very easily. But, I don't know. I think you probably got, if you had a reasonable income in London, you could afford to live somewhere a bit nicer, that you probably had a lot more variety in terms of the foods available. Whereas if you'd lived somewhere like Stratford, you were very dependent, obviously, on what you could grow. The road network, such as it was, I mean, if anyone's watched the Upstart Crow, it's always Shakespeare's or the character that's played by
David Mitchell, isn't it?
Yeah, David Mitchell is always moaning about the coaches being late and everything, and it's very funny because it's supposed to mirror our current rail system. But I imagine that you weren't unless you were literally rearing it or growing it yourself, you weren't getting nice treats on a regular basis, like Seville oranges, for example, which clearly cannot be grown in this country, and nor could they be back then.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, okay. After all this warm-up and introduction, let's go to the meat of our conversation today. Okay. So I thought, and you thought, that we should approach this opportunity to talk about food in Shakespeare time, about something different, about basically how do certain nationalities associated with certain foods, and what does it tell us about the period then, about the attitudes, and about also about us generally as people all the time. And what really constituted the foreigner in the early modern period?
Well, it's interesting because I don't think in a lot of ways it's changed a great deal. So obviously the obvious answer is if you weren't born in this country. So if you were born in France or Denmark or one of the German states as they would have been then you presumably had allegiance to that king and therefore you were deemed to be a foreigner. But there's also this idea of otherness, that you don't belong to a place. And I think I'm correct in saying that could be a lot more localised. So the example you give of Stratford-upon-Avon versus London in terms of living, I'm pretty sure if you came from a maybe further north than Stratford-upon-Avon, say from Manchester way, and you had a slightly different accent, you were deemed to be a foreigner in the eyes of people living in London, but perhaps not quite as foreign as someone from the Netherlands, for example, or the Low Countries as it was called then. So in a lot of ways it hasn't changed, but perhaps I think because we couldn't get around, you have people that wouldn't have travelled at all. They would have barely left their little village, let alone travel to another country or even a big city in this period. So I would think, there was this idea that if you were from a different, maybe not quite the village next door, but you know what I mean? If you were from a different part of the British Isles, certainly you would be deemed to be a foreigner. And definitely that comes across in the play when I talk about the British Isles. So if people from Wales and Scotland and Ireland, as at that point, were considered certainly to be foreigners, I would suggest.
Yes, certainly. Like on that period, England was a separate kingdom in a sense.
Yeah.
Wales was just very recently, incorporated. Yeah, there was still this foreign element, very, very specific.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And basically what was the prevalence of foreigners in England at the time, and how visible were as people, basically?
Well, I can't really speak for sort of the environs, regional towns. I mean, I suspect some of them, like Norwich, for example, I think had quite a lot of Flemish people. Brigitte Webster would certainly have a better idea about that because that's where she's based, and she's written extensively about this period, eating with the Tudors and everything, her lovely book that she wrote. But in London, it was, a big trading city. So we had a lot of international trade. And whilst the people that were coming and going from London may not have been living there long term, it might have been quite a transient population, there would have been lots of different nationalities in the city at different times of the year and different periods, of, even within Shakespeare's lifetime, depending on who we were fighting with at the time.
Yeah,
I have to brush up on my biggest one is obviously the Spanish.
The Spanish, yes.
But and we had certainly quite an influx, I believe, in the 1560s of Protestant refugees coming from mainland Europe to France, again, the Netherlands, because that was, I think, at this time part of the Holy Roman Empire, who were essentially Catholic, but obviously, so they weren't very, very keen on the Protestants. So we had quite an influx of, I guess you'd call them, they're not just religious refugees, they're political refugees as well to a degree, coming over and bringing their influences. And actually there was a contemporary of Shakespeare's called John Lyly, I'm going to say Lyly, it's spelled Lyly, who compared England to a hodgepodge or a gallimaufry, which basically means that there was a real mix of nationalities. Now he's saying England, but I don't know how widely dispersed these sort of international inhabitants were at this time. I would suggest they were mostly centred around the larger cities or towns, such as, I say, Norwich or London, possibly Bristol. I don't know when Bristol really took off as a port town, but so it was, there were quite a number of people here. We had, it wasn't like someone turned up and we were like, oh, who are you? And I did a podcast recently, set slightly later, but it was exploring the legacy of Mary Wollaston, who was a black woman who ran a healing well in London in the 1660s. So, okay, we're talking, 100 years later, but this is before slavery. I mean, she was a free woman. There was no, slavery did exist, but it hadn't ramped up to the level it would do in the following the end of that century and the following century.
Yeah.
So she was living quite happily, and there's no, it was the most remarkable thing was that she, probably from the eyes of the people that wrote about her, was that she was running a well, not the colour of her skin, the fact that she was a woman running a business.
Her business, yes, exactly. That's more weird.
So I mean, I think they were quite well foreigners, if you want to call them that, were quite well integrated into society. But that doesn't, as we know today, doesn't stop people from having their own prejudices, I'm afraid.
Exactly. So I bet, like in Shakespeare's plays, the foreign characters that have certain traits, how are they portrayed in the plays themselves?
Well, yeah, see, this is the thing where it's perhaps slightly more problematic these days, because they are often, not always, often played for laughs.
Of course.
There's Parson Hugh Evans, for example, in The Merry Wives of Windsor, or Captain Llewellyn and Henry V, who are both Welsh.
Yeah.
And, quite often these characters are portrayed as having, well, I guess we would call it a speech impediment, but they mispronounce words. So I think in Merry Wives, Parson Hughes tells Falstaff that his belly is all putter rather than butter, which Falstaff responds by saying, "Have I lived to stand to taunt at one that makes fritters of English?" So, they are, really, and I mean, obviously Merry Wives of Windsor is a comedy, so it kind of stands to reason that some of the characters have exaggerated. Dr. Caius as well is a French doctor who is played, I've seen this play performed recently, and he has an exaggerated French accent that frankly makes the cast of Hello, Hello look quite legit. But it's done that way on purpose. I mean, also, let's not forget, we always had a somewhat fractious relationship with our sort of Gallic neighbours.
Exactly.
Throughout history,
both Wales and
Scottish,
yes,
absolutely,
Irish, yes.
But yes,
so I guess these nationalities will also be looked upon less favourably in the plays than others, or do you have something more? I guess the Welsh, I suppose. Yeah,
it depends. I mean, there's. It's hard to say whether people were anti-Welsh. It's hard to assume that they're not anti-Welsh. I'll be honest, when we read them from a modern viewpoint, but they're portrayed as, I don't know. It depends which play you read it. So Llewellyn, for example, Captain Llewellyn in Henry V. For him, there's this whole scene about the eating of the leeks. And this interchange with him and the ensign Pistol, and who Pistol basically accuses him of being a leek eater. Now, of course, on a surface level, we're thinking, well, that's quite insulting because the leek is a national emblem of Wales and he's Welsh. But it's actually, at that point, it was more to do with the fact he was essentially implying he was lower class because he was eating leeks, which were a vegetable. And I'm sure wealthy people did eat vegetables, but it wasn't, it was, the implication there is more that you're not very cultured and everything. And then the scene ends with Llewellyn trying to force feed Pistol leeks, which in itself was dangerous because quite often vegetables the view was that vegetables have to be cooked. I mean, I'm not sure I've ever had a raw leek, but I don't think they would be particularly pleasant anyway.
It would be very oniony, I suppose. You will need a bit of...
a young one might be okay, but, like big ones you get in the winter, not so much.
Yeah, not so much.
No. But again, it's because they had the whole point of wearing the leek in the cap was it was a symbol of national pride. So the fact that Pistol is even attacking that is seen as being quite offensive to Llewellyn, who is a Welshman. And you say it's that scene. I don't think it depends how it's. I'm not sure it was written for laughs necessarily, but it's often played again as a slight comic interlude in this play.
Yeah.
But I think it can, if you actually unpick it, it's quite It's quite a harsh scene in many ways. Kenneth Branagh apparently wouldn't put it in the film when he did it, Henry V, because he said modern audiences won't get it. They just won't understand.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, you can say that. That, makes sense. Let's mention here that you have a recipe for leeks in the book.
Yes, I do.
It's a pretty nice recipe as well.
It is, but I should say that it isn't. So this is kind of one of those weird things. So we don't have in the early modern sources. I didn't come across any. I mean, you get the occasional mention of leek as an ingredient and maybe a pottage, but it's not used like we would today as an ingredient. And I really wanted, because this is, this scene is quite famous. I really wanted to include a leek recipe. So I've made a gratin of leeks for Llewellyn, but it's an entirely modern recipe. And I do say that in the introduction. There are a few unashamedly modern recipes, because I love the quote so much, or the scene so much, and I really wanted to include a recipe, but I couldn't find a quote, or I couldn't find a recipe that was appropriate for that quote. So there is a modern leek gratin in there, which is very nice, and I think it uses carefully to keep in with the Welsh
theme. Yes,
Welsh theme. So
leeks are great. I mean, gratin. But you can make fritters. You can put in pottages, and
I don't know what it is, because there's a recipe also in the book for boiled onions. Well, when I say boiled onions, that makes it sound really nasty. That's much nicer than it sounds, folks, honestly. And that is a recipe from an English cookbook. So we did eat onions, but leeks and garlic, not so much. Garlic's even, I think, scarcer than leeks.
Right.
You see it creeping back in. I think a few of Robert May in, again, 1660s starts including it, but it's a rarity. And yet garlic is mentioned in Shakespeare several times. Not necessarily in positive terms, I add. But it is mentioned. So, we knew about it. It's not like we didn't know what garlic was.
Yeah. And then, if we fast forward 400 years, from around 1950s until 1980s, these flavorings, garlic and onion, and they were quite rare in the English cooking. They were afraid of taste.
Well, this is it. There's Peter Kay. I'm not even going to try and do his accent. Garlic bread. Garlic bread. Yeah, I mean, it was very much like. I mean, my grandmother was my paternal grandmother was sort of very cautious of using garlic.
Exotic ingredient. Smells, yes. Oh, the breath,
And yet, it was, you do see it. I mean, even thinking Victorian times, it did crop up in recipes, but early modern period in English recipes, not so much. Now, there is I do have a few Italian recipes in there, and that they have an entirely different view on garlic and things like cheese, which is another thing you don't see in English cookbooks.
Yeah, how funny. It feels like some things hasn't changed. Lots of things changed, obviously. You're listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. So what were the fears of foreigners and foreign food as well based upon? What was the...
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it's fear of the unknown. I'm going to have to look because I can't quote off the top of my head with these quotes. There's lots of wonderful quotes in there. So part of it is obviously, I say, fear of the unknown. Then we have, there's these misconceptions. And we get this today, it's, that people only eat, or like you say, like the garlic thing, for example, we've just touched on. But the idea that certain nationalities eat certain foods, so like I say, Llewellyn and the leeks, for example. But there were some more, harsher views perhaps about foreigners and what they brought into the country. And there's a play It's not a well-known Shakespeare play, Sir Thomas More. I think it has only been identified relatively recently. I mean, when I use that term relatively recently, people think I mean like last week. But in my world, anything in the past 100 years is relatively recent. Yeah. So I don't know exactly when, but they have identified. It's actually, I believe, one of the few manuscripts that they actually have a sample of William Shakespeare's writing. I don't think he wrote this exclusively. I think it was a collaboration. I forget with who. But the play is about Sir Thomas More, he was an advisor to Henry VIII. I think he was Lord Chancellor actually to Henry VIII. And he was a Protestant, but what I call a true Protestant, not a pretend one that just decided they were going to, like Henry VIII, who just didn't want to be part of the Catholic Church anymore. Sir Thomas More was, so his life did not end very well, let's just say that. So anyway, Shakespeare has written this play or co-written this play based on Sir Thomas More. And it centres around, a lot of the action centres around the May Day riots of 1517, when they'd had bad harvests and there was a real scarcity of food. And there was a fear that the foreigners were eating more than their fair share, essentially. So that was one of the stereotypes, is that foreigners were gluttonous and ate too much and more than their fair share. Then there's the other aspect that they bring in disease and they eat strange foods, which also promote disease. So there's this entire exchange between a character called Lincoln and Williamson, and they're talking about parsnips, which you wouldn't think a parsnip would do. How could that possibly be offensive? But, Lincoln says they bring in strange roots, which is merely the undoing of poor prentices for what's a sorry parsnip to a good heart. And then it goes on later to say that they are infected with the palsy. Do you want me to read the next part of the line?
I would love you to do that.
Okay, it contains a naughty word, folks, so you might want to cover your words. It's just at this period, it was probably not quite as bad. Well, I don't know, it probably was as bad, it's probably worse. But anyway, he says, "Nay, it is infected with the palsy. These bastards of dung, as you know, they grow in dung, have infected us, and it is our infection will make the city shake, which partly comes through the eating of parsnips." Now, so we have this idea that, parsnips, I don't know much of the history on parsnips. I know they are in medieval form of curry, so I assume we'd known about parsnips for a while. It's not like they were a new vegetable to this country. But there's this view, partly, I guess, because they grew underground, but there were dietitians of the time, like Thomas Coggan, who wrote The Haven of Health, who thought that parsnips provoked lusts. So we now, not only do they cause disease, but they also provoke lust. So all in all, in this play particularly, the foreigners are deemed to be eating too much and potentially spreading disease and lust, and possibly spreading disease, like the French poxes, but they used to like to call it syphilis and things like that. So, when you see that, you think, well, that's quite harsh, actually.
We have to say, obviously, this xenophobia in a sense, the fear of the unknown, or as you said earlier, and mixed obviously with things that we don't know about diseases, the modern way of how this is transmitted. You also have, in addition to that, you have starvation. You have periods that the crops don't grow well. So all these things, they play a role on how people think and feel, but also in the plays themselves. This food is a symbol, to tell us about the other things that happen behind the scenes, the riots, the food riots, and all that stuff. Yeah, it's highly symbolic. But it's an interesting period about socioeconomic conditions at the time, right? Things were in flux a lot.
They were. And this is the thing with Shakespeare, and I'm guessing his fellow playwrights were doing exactly the same. People like Ben Jonson and Christopher Marlowe. They were reflecting not only the views of the populace at the time, but also what was going on in the world. So obviously Shakespeare's writing his play on Sir Thomas More, a long time after Sir Thomas More had been executed. So it's, and the riots, the May Day riots of 1517, we're talking a good well, more than 50 years.
Yeah.
So that has passed since then, almost getting on for, possibly 100 years since they occurred. But in his other plays, some which aren't actually set in England, so it's not immediately obvious, but if you look at when they were written, like Coriolanus was written in the 1590s when we'd had a series of really bad harvests. So Coriolanus opens with a scene of the citizens protesting against the hoarding of grain by the rich. And hence, the first citizen says, "Suffer us to famish, and their storehouses crammed with grain." Now, at the time, it could have been a similar scenario in Britain. The poor perhaps weren't getting access to the grain because it was being stockpiled by people that controlled the harvest, essentially the richer farmers and merchants or whatever. So it was a real concern for people that, there was there was shortage of food. I mean, bread has always, as it has in so many European nations, been a staple, and you can't make bread without, well, you can make bread without flour, wheat flour, or barley flour or rye flour, because at this time it wouldn't have been, to be fair, not everyone was eating fine white bread. But even so, the subsistence ingredients that you have to use, for example, like acorns, they may have been scarce as well. So, it was a really pertinent thing for him to, I think, reflect the mood of the time in his plays, albeit, like I say, that Coriolanus is set in Roman, during the Roman period. So
and also
centuries before.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the plays are set in Italy or Greece, ancient Greece, and so on. That in that world, but they reflect the contemporary or near contemporary situation that Shakespeare lived in, and it makes sense. Also, it makes sense that you use the food on that respect as symbolic to what happened to you now.
And again, it comes back to this whole idea that, well, we haven't got much food to feed our citizens, the English. Why should we be feeding foreigners too?
Yeah.
And there's a green-eyed monster as well, maybe of the foreigners. I hate calling them that, but that's what we're talking about. Were, perhaps they were successful in business, for example, or, whether that were the weaving business or importing goods from, their home nations. There is that sort of comes into play as well, isn't it? People jealous of their success, because then they would have been able to afford, presumably, the higher prices for the breads and whatever if, the harvest had been bad and grain was scarce. Putting the price of bread and basics up. So, not good.
Not good, yeah.
Not good.
Do you think at the time, like the early modern English people got influenced by European food in any way?
Well, this is the interesting thing. So Joan Thirsk writes about this in her book on early modern food. And, one of the things that's always puzzled me, especially when I started writing this book, is there's quite a lot of cheese in Shakespeare. Cheese crops up a lot, but cheese, as you probably know, is not a common ingredient in the recipe books of the time. So I'm sort of talking late 16th, early 17th century.
Yeah.
Okay, when we get to sort of 1615-ish, when Gervase Markham writes his book on the English housewife, there is a section in there on dairying. So clearly there's a shift sort of between sort of the end of the 16th century into the 17th century, where we start to see, so cheese and butter had been very much viewed as white meats. Well, my white meats, I mean, they were fasting foods. They were the sort of things you ate if you could get hold of them when you weren't allowed to eat meat, when we were a Catholic nation particularly, and we had our fasting days and particularly intense fasting periods like Lent and Advent. And also they were kind of deemed to be, you ate cheese if you were poor. Now, the interesting thing is that obviously, as I say, there's quite a lot of cheese. There's toasted cheese. The cheese sounds quite nice in Shakespeare. Even I didn't hold sort of exploration into what Banbury cheese was because I was curious, and I spoke to your lovely friend Ned Palmer about this, and I had my eyes opened in terms of what Banbury cheese could have been, and felt rather sad afterwards that it seems to have dwindled but disappeared. So what we do start to see is, these often cheese, when it is mentioned, this is what Thirsk says, is that it's mentioned that it's not our local cheeses so much as foreign cheese. So Parmesan, I don't know whether it's Edam Gouda, but there is definitely a sort of a Flemish cheese that's mentioned. And it's these cheeses that seem to be more revered by the wealthier than perhaps things like Cheshire, for example, and Banbury cheese, although these are starting to become more popular. So, I think whether that's a rubbing, it's just tastes are changing, or whether that is the influence of other nationalities on Britain. Because I say, by the time we get to the early 17th century, Gervais Markham has an entire chapter on dairying, which includes butter making and does talk about cheese as well. So by the time, it's hard to imagine if you look in a cookbook from sort of the mid 17th century onwards for butter not to be in there.
Right. I suppose we're talking about butter and cheese as ingredients in dishes and recipes as well, right? That's the most important thing. Like, not
apparently we didn't spread it on bread quite so much. I think it is used. So you start to see pastry recipes that use butter, but it wasn't spread on bread. That apparently was something that the Flemish did, and we adopted.
We copied from the
and
Flemish.
Apparently it was a reason why they drank so much beer, because they had really salty butter and they spread it on their bread, and that's why they drank so much beer. I'm just quoting other historians here, folks. I'm not saying that's true, but again, that's probably talk about stereotypes. That's that sort of comes from that. I'm sure it was a stereotype that was engendered in our psyche at this point. So there's Hugh Evans, for example. The Welsh, again, have always often had this association with cheese. Hugh Evans is looking forward to the end of his dinner where he's going to have pippins and cheese, pippins being a type of apple. And there's, I say, a number of references to toasted cheese. But it's weird because if you look at 17th, 16th century Italian cookbooks, cheese is used quite a lot, like Bartolomeo Scappi's book. There's quite a lot of cheese recipes in there. And it's sort of a difference between what they call new and old cheese being fresh and sort of harder cheeses that have been matured. So I'm glad we started eating cheese. I love cheese.
Yeah. I think we are of a similar mindset. Yeah, definitely. Earlier on our conversation, you did mention a little bit food references that they're very much of the time and they will go above our heads today, the audience today. Like, what kind of things you meant, if you can analyze a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it? It's so there's the Taming of the Shrew. It instantly springs to mind because I believe this is quite a problematic play from a production-ish perspective because of the way Caterina is treated by Petruchio. And it's sort of deemed to be, it's very misogynistic, it's coercive behaviour. But there's a particular scene where Caterina she is the shrew. She's deemed to be very choleric, as they would have called it back then, which means quick to anger, sharp, and to moderate her behaviour. It was very much believed in this period, you are what you eat. So if you had to, the idea is that they should give her food that is going to make her less choleric, less angry. And so it ends up that she hasn't had anything to eat for a while. And Petruchio's servant, Grumio, she says in the end, I need to eat something. Do you marry me to famish me? And he's like, he offers her all these lists of foods. But every time he offers her something, he says, oh no, we can't have that because it'll make you more choleric. Now, a lot of the foods that he offers her to modern audiences, if they understand what they are at all, they're going to go, I think it's like a neat's foot, which is like cow's foot, cow heel. I think tripe, and there was something else as well. I can't remember what the other thing is, but they're all things that we would all be sitting there. The audiences are going to be going, "Oh my God, that's disgusting!" But they weren't disgusting, and they're actually quite nice foods. And it ends up with saying, he offers her beef and mustard, which everyone will understand what beef and mustard is, but then says, well, you can't have the beef because it will make you choleric, so maybe you can have the mustard. And she's at this point, she's desperate. She's like, I'll have anything you give me, just give me something to eat. And he says, well, yeah, but I can't give you the mustard because that's even worse than the beef. So no, you can't have beef or mustard. So Sheila Kavanagh, who's a Shakespearean scholar, says there's been some ingenious ways in which to stage this play and this particular scene to sort of mitigate sometimes the less distastefulness of it. I mean, it's interesting when you hear her speak about it, because it's, nowadays I think it's one of what is classed as a problem play, because it's the way Katerina, the main character, is treated is not particularly nice.
Yeah. I suppose food was used a lot as a metaphor, as we said earlier. So I mean, things change. Yeah, like it's 500 years or more. Past. And the references change.
But I mean, a lot of the time there are food references which nowadays don't make any sense at all. I know, even though, of course, the way they're performed, you sometimes get them. I mean, actually, the scene I've just described is kind of obvious if you know the story, kind of where it's going. You just may be forgiven for thinking that she's being offered horrible foods, but she isn't. But some of the more obscure things, particularly when they're talking about sex. Now, I don't think I have spoken to Shakespeare scholars about this, and it wasn't so much censorship. I think it was just done again, perhaps more to be a bit more tongue-in-cheek and a bit funny, because, food is something we can all relate to. But, of course, to us, modern audiences, there's the scene I'm about to talk about, stuff we don't do generally anyway. So I'm talking about a scene for The Merry Wives of Windsor where Abraham Slender, who has been called a Banbury cheese, and there's we could go down a whole different rabbit hole with that one, but he says this line, and he says, I bruised my shin the other day with playing at sword and dagger with a master of the fence. 3 pennies for a dish of stewed prunes, and by my troth, I cannot abide the smell of hot meat since. Now, of course, you hear that word, when you see it played, it's delivered, and you think, okay, so he's talking about fencing. We don't fence, sword fight, there's a rule. I don't, anyway. I would suggest anyone that does is going to get arrested, so please don't, folks, unless you're actually in a fencing match. So he's having this fencing spar for whatever reason, and which is, with swords, you're like, okay, but what on earth's got prunes and hot meat have got to do with fencing or sword fighting?
Right, well,
yeah. Actually, when you unpick it, stewed prunes placed in the window of a building signified, were supposedly symbolic of a brothel.
Right.
Prostitutes were often compared to joints of meat, such as mutton. And veni, if you look it up online in the Oxford English Dictionary or any of these other dictionaries that exist online, means to thrust. So basically, he's talking about having a bad sex with a prostitute. So you wouldn't, and it's in the context, it is in the context of the scene, it wouldn't be immediately obvious, because I think if memory serves me right, he is actually going to dinner. So you just think, okay, well, he's just, okay, doesn't really make sense, but it's the easy thing to do. And I used to do this myself, to be fair, especially when I was at school. You just use, it's just Shakespeare, you just wrote a load of twaddle. But it's not, it's a load of twaddle. It does actually make sense if you unpick it, but you've got to have the knowledge of the food and what the symbolism of things like stewed prunes and the fact that prostitutes were often compared to joints of meat. Yeah. And actually the whole, it is sex at the end of the day, but it's, it's quite obvious when it's explained like that. You're like, oh yeah, actually I can see now. That's, I can safely say, having sat at the Globe and watched this last summer, I think I was one of the few people in the audience that got it.
Right.
Like my husband's a bit like me when I watch the historical reproductions on Sun, they get the food wrong, and he's like, it's only you that notices that. So anyway.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you have a recipe to suggest here for us?
Oh gosh, yeah. So we've been talking about sort of influences of different foreigners. You can have bad sex and eat mutton if you want to, or whatever. I was going to say, talking about the influence of foreigners, I would go for, in the book, there's a dish called buttered restons, which restons are like a spice bun. Got saffron and other spices in. But it actually, when you read the full recipe, it tells you how to make the buns, and it tells you to cut them into quarters and put a ridiculous amount of butter on, which I think this recipe was good from the good Housewife's Handmade for the Kitchen, which I think is usually attributed to Thomas Dawson around the mid 1590s.
Contemporary, basically.
Yeah. And I've cut down the butter considerably, but he basically smothers them in butter. It's like bread and butter pudding, basically, but without the cream. Smothers them in butter and covers them with more sugar and spices. But actually, when you make it, it is like, you're like, oh, yeah. And that's the other thing. A lot of people, you probably get this as well. People say to me, oh, food from the past must be disgusting. And I'm like, actually, it isn't. Sometimes it sounds weird, but if you've just got to try this recipe. Yeah. And I sort of struggled before to get my head around it. And sometimes you literally do have to make things and go, yeah, okay.
You have to really make them and try and, And as you said, like this, the familiarity and the unfamiliarity always plays a role. And then, of course, now we're talking about we have unfamiliar terminology, like for what the methods of cooking and the measures are. So, those things as well play a role. So, there must be examples that you can give me about like measurements for quantities, for example, or terms they used for boiling and grilling that we like, what the heck is that now?
Yeah, so and one that springs to mind is carbonadoed. And actually that is mentioned a couple of times in Shakespeare's plays. Yeah. And it's essentially, as far as I gather, it was putting, if you look at Peter Breers, who wrote a great book on cooking in Tudor and Stuart England, he talks about these, I guess, like almost like I want to say like a cage. I think we'd put fish in them now, but they would put meat, because they didn't have ovens and stuff like we have now. So yes, they had bread ovens. And if you had a really big house, you might have had a bread oven. But generally speaking, most cooking was done in front of or over a fire. So basically you'd put your cut of meat in these, or like a chop, for example, in this cage, and you could cook it over the fire, but it would get scored and scarred, if you liked. A bit like char grilling today.
Yeah.
But obviously we have different methods of doing that. And there's a couple of references in Shakespeare's plays where characters have been described as being scarred or carbonadoed because they've got scars on their faces and stuff.
Of course, yeah.
But initially you wonder what the heck a carbonado is. I suppose it's a bit like speaking a foreign language. You get your eye in after a while. So words like sod, which means boiled, you start to realise what these mean, and it's you just. I don't know, your brain just adapts. It's a bit like reading a foreign language. If you speak a foreign language, I wouldn't even try to read Greek for that matter. But for me, like, I can read French reasonably well. So it's a bit like that, getting your eye in. And the other thing to say is that a lot of the recipes were written with large, very large households in mind. So you have to cut them down. So when they talk about something like a pottle, and that's the other thing, the internet's brilliant now. You can Google these, what's a pottle in imperial measures or whatever, and it tells you this, like half a gallon or whatever. And then you go, oh, okay, that's a lot. Most recipes, when you're writing for a modern cookbook, they want you to cook for sort of like, I'd say 4 to 8 generally.
Yeah, exactly. That's something like that. 4 to 8. So what is pottles? Do you know where it's coming from? Like what kind of measure is like in terms of?
No, I mean it's quite. I think
because you could say like a pint has the pedigree. A pint has a pedigree from the Roman time, but it was a measure of this and that. Yeah,
you do have to be careful with pints. Because pints, I don't know when, I always forget, I always have to Google this. I'm being perfectly honest, folks. When we changed to our imperial pint, but our pint, British pint now is like 564 mils, something like ridiculous.
That, isn't it? Yeah,
we'll call it 600. Let's not split hairs over that 30 mils. But in this period, a pint was more like, it was basically an American. The Americans basically didn't change their pints. We probably shouldn't have changed our pints. I don't know why we changed our pints. Someone will know that answer, but we didn't. We decided to change our pints. The Americans didn't. And so when you see a pint from this period, it's, I think it's about 480 mils,
right,
thereabouts. So and you think it wouldn't make that much difference, but if you're talking about just liquid going into like a pottage, it's neither here nor there. But if you're making like a sauce or something, actually it can.
It makes a lot of difference.
It can make a lot of. So you have to bear things like that in mind.
Yeah,
and it can lead you down, to some disasters otherise. But
of course,
I've been doing it for a long time now, so hopefully I don't have too many disasters.
What? Talking about you talked about this cage thing for the meat. What other kind of kitchen implements and gadgets were the go-to things at the time for the kitchen?
Gosh, well, I don't know really. I mean, I think they wouldn't have had. I mean, obviously they didn't have electric whisks and things like that. They use twigs and whatnot. But as I always say to people, I'm not expecting you to whisk egg whites with a bunch of twigs for 8 hours. You can
it takes time as well. Yeah, it takes like.
Yeah, I've never tried because I'm just like, no. I just don't. I have issues enough with my shoulders with my scoliosis. I can't possibly be whisking egg whites for 8 hours with twigs. I don't know, because I'm not really an expert on kitchenalia from this period. I mean, they would have had things, like sort of the gingerbread molds and stuff for making fancier things. You see those often referenced. I mean, as far as I can gather, like I say, a lot of cooking was done in a pot.
So
hence pottage.
Yeah, the metallic pots, like the big.
And I don't know when spit jacks and stuff. I mean, they were roasting in front of fires.
Yeah, they would have a spit roast, but not with the spit jacks. Probably with a poor boy.
I was going to say, at this point, I suspect it was some poor little kid that had to run around or pull and push the wheel round so that the joint was going round sort of evenly, getting evenly cooked. Yeah, you need someone like Ivan Day or Peter Breers to answer that one, I think.
Yeah. When you looked for the recipes for the book and other instructions and other manuals, what did you find recipes that reflect the time? Like, obviously, there were some recipe books, some cookbooks, but they weren't so widespread, and they were, I guess, more for aristocratic kitchens and higher classes, right?
Yeah, I mean, you do get people, and actually this is something that continued through to the 18th century. You do get women particularly that would keep household records. And I mean, we'd call them recipe books now, but they contain everything from recipes for food to recipes for medicines. So I guess one of the most famous ones that you can still get, I'm not sure you can get a new copy, you can probably still pick up secondhand copies, is Lady Eleanor Fetterplace, who I think was living probably the end of when she was starting to keep her book. We're probably looking at the end of Shakespeare's life, so early 17th century. But it's famous because Hilary Spurling, who sort of converted it, and I was going to say translated, but it didn't need translating. It was written in English. But she took she's married into the Fetterplace family, basically, or one of Fetterplace's descendants, and came across this book, and she wrote a book I think in the 1980s, sort of pulling out some of the recipes. And it's very well done, actually, because it's done in seasons. So the one thing I would say about these household manuals is you get everything bunged in to one book, but not necessarily in a logical order. So you'll have a recipe for like a posset, and then there'll be some kind of roast, and then there'll be a recipe for how to cure the bite of a mad dog, and then there'll be, I don't know, something else, it's edible. So they weren't, it's very much, I guess, a bit like we search on the internet now, don't we, for recipes? Right. I guess that's how they were doing it in the 16th century, is they'd go somewhere, they'd talk to a friend and they'd go, I've got this good recipe, and they'd write it down in their little book and make a record of it. But there was no indexing or anything like that. It was just, and actually even the printed recipe books are a bit like that. So they can be rather random on the way recipes are put in the books.
But yeah, this lady Eleanor, you found things there. You looked on.
Yeah, no, it was good. I didn't use an awful lot from there, but it's good because you get an idea of how a household was managed and at times of the year where they would do things. I think she talks about making like fresh cheese, for example. I think that's in the spring. I say it's been done very well. I don't know whether that was Sperling's editing.
Right.
Or I suspect the entries are date reference, perhaps, or whether that's how it actually was, because it's not a facsimile reprint. It's been edited by Hilary Sperling and reprinted that way. But yeah, I mean, Eleanor Fetterplace is just an example of so many women, wealthy women, I should add, of this period, who managed the household, but they weren't just responsible for feeding the household. So would she have been in the kitchen? She would probably have been overseeing a cook in terms of the day-to-day cooking. But when it came to things like candying, for example, and the sweet stuff, because sugar and spices were still incredibly expensive, that was the domain of the lady of the house. And I think there's a recipe in Much Ado, which is one of hers, from Lady Eleanor's white biscuit, she calls them, which again, this is the other thing with, terminology. It's called a white biscuit, but actually when you read the recipe, it's essentially a meringue. She doesn't use that term, but it's whisked egg whites, sugar, and she puts anise in it. And it actually makes that's weird. The aniseed makes it more refreshing. I find meringues quite cloying, but
I know what you mean.
The aniseed, it's quite and I've taken those and used them in a modern berry mess, like Eton mess, but with frozen berries, because as much as I love Eton mess in the summer, I don't think you should eat it all year round because strawberries are only in season in the summer. So there's recipes like that she would have been in. Certainly, I would have been involved in making.
Yeah,
because the ingredients were so expensive. And actually, there is I think in Romeo and Juliet, there's a line where someone asks for the keys or from Lady Capulet for the spice cupboard.
For the spice, yes.
Yeah, because they were kept under lock and key.
Of course.
By the lady of the house.
Of course. You mentioned earlier on a little bit flittingly again, Bartolomeo Scapi and his work.
Yes.
And you have a recipe for roasted pheasant in the book.
Oh, yes, I love that one. Yeah.
I love that one too. Can you tell us a little bit about Bartolomeo Scapi? Who was he and why?
Gosh.
Yeah. Why he has...
Well, I'll try off the top of my head.
Yes.
He was, don't ask me which pope, he was a papal chef. So he was an Italian chef and he did work for a pope. I forget which one, but it would have been, his book came out, I think around 1570 or the mid 1570s. I don't know whether it was published posthumously. I think if it wasn't posthumously, it was towards the end of his life. So I think he was probably working... He's probably more likely to have been a contemporary of Henry VIII.
Yeah,
possibly. Yeah. But again, the Italians, I mean, much like now, the Italian food's lovely. But the rest, that particular recipe it's one of those things, it's a recipe for the stuffing. And at the end of the stuffing, it says it goes well with roasted pheasant. And then you go to the roasted pheasant, which is like, his book is hugely complicated to navigate. I mean, you can get it. I do recommend it, but that really does take some getting used to. Have you got a copy?
No, I don't.
It's not as straightforward. There's a lot of, it's very big and there's a lot of moving around the book in terms of when they cross references. It's been cross referenced, but again, it's quite complicated. But so there's this stuffing that he uses, which has got, I think, pork and veal in it and fennel seed, again, that aniseed flavour.
Yeah.
But it is beautiful. And actually, with pheasant, it works wonderfully because it sort of lubricates the pheasant. And that is one of my, you said favourite recipes, but that is one of my favourite recipes, actually.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, so I'm just looking on the Wikipedia page. He was the personal chef of Pope Pius IV. It says here, yeah. And he gained fame in 1570s with his monumental cookbook, Opera dell'arte del cucinare.
Yeah, which you say much better than me, Tom. So, yeah, I mean, you can get Terence Scully did a translation. It's been brilliantly done, I should add, but it's done in different. There's about 5 books within the main book, and things aren't necessarily where you think they're going to be.
Excellent.
That's all I'm going to say. So there is a lot of like you read it and it'll say, "Oh, this is great for." And then you're like, and then there'll be a footnote saying, "Look at this." Oh, okay. So you have to go to a different book and a different recipe, and
very, very different way of writing cookbooks as from what we do now. Yeah.
I don't know whether that's how the actual book is, because I wouldn't be able to read. I don't speak Italian, so I wouldn't be able to. I assume it would have been written in Italian.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it was written in Latin. Anyway, I don't speak either anyway, so it wouldn't make any.
Time to start. Come on.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Never say never and all that.
Let me take you back to 16th century. Let me take you to England. You and I, we are 2 people attending a play in London in the theatre of good old Shakespeare. What are we eating? We are in the theatre itself. Do we have food there? Can we eat there?
I would imagine so, because if you go and see a Shakespeare play today, they're quite long.
Were they even longer back then? Like in terms of...
I don't know, actually. I suspect not, because I suspect they were, they moved scenery around and that was part of the experience. I don't think there was any like curtain coming down or anything like that. I don't know what they would have been eating. I've heard references to nuts being eaten in the I was going to say auditorium, I suppose, in the theatre.
Yeah.
I would imagine it would have to be something quite portable. We didn't have sandwiches back then. Well, not technically anyway. So I would suspect it would have been things like pies, like chewits. So
chewits, okay.
Chewits are, I think, are generally expected to be small pies. There is a recipe in the book for little chewits as well. So they were like, I guess, like a small handheld. I mean, they often have feeling as the ones do in the book, but they were small pies that you could hold in your hand, as opposed to a large sort of stately pie that would be appearing at a feast.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess things like oysters, especially in London, where I suppose, where you think where the Globe is situated today is not dissimilar location to where it would have been. And there were a number of theatres. It wasn't just the Globe. There was the Rose Theatre. There was another one that escapes me right now. But so I think, you would have had things that could have been easily transported and disposed of, either because you'd eaten the crust, in the case of a pie, or you could just get rid of the shells. So, I don't think I don't think they would have been eating like kebabs or anything like that, or definitely not popcorn. So
not popcorn.
Not popcorn.
Yes. I guess the audience themselves, they would bring the food. There was somebody selling food.
I don't know, actually. I wouldn't be surprised if there were people selling food inside. I think, I think it would have been, I suspect it would have been much like it is today. They probably would have had to pay a premium to get inside. I don't know, but... it wouldn't surprise me if you could get refreshments inside.
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah.
But who knows? Yeah. And there were obviously taverns nearby, so you could go and get, wet your whistle afterwards, so to speak,
Exactly. Yeah. Good old times in London.
Yeah.
Fantastic. You're listening to the Delicious Legacy podcast by me, Tom Dinas. There's more to come after the break, and it gets better. Now, I've been asking you many stuff. Do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, so I did actually, we've talked about this whole idea of foreigners and stuff, and obviously you're Greek. So I wonder if, there's any stereotypes of Greek people, Greek food that annoy you now in the modern age.
Yeah. Food-wise, there were a lot more, I think, when I first moved in the UK, like 25 or so years ago. But I think over the years, either I mellowed down a little bit, or or obviously I think, I probably have a point. Anyway, the first thing for me that was annoying me, I think still annoys me actually, is when people we talk and they say, I'm Greek, blah, blah. And the first thing they say, I hate olives or I hate feta cheese and start with this kind of negative image of something. And it's like, come on, this is my staples. These are my sacred foods. You cannot possibly say you hate this stuff. And so that kind of irked me a little bit. And on the opposite scale of that is when people immediately they will say when we talk about Greece and Greek food, gyros, souvlaki, and they love it probably, but it's like, okay, that's just fast food. That's wait on the street on the night out. It's not actually something important and something that I'm proud of. It's not a dish that it's really, really dear to me. It's more like a naughty treat. So that's something that annoys me. And obviously, it's not exactly food, but when the thing about Greeks smashing plates and drinking news all the time, and it's not.
No.
Yeah, but I haven't smashed a plate in my life. I don't know. I've never done that thing.
No, I should imagine your mum would tell you off. She'd tell me off if I started smashing plates.
But no, it's something that you do in clubs, apparently. But yeah, I've never done it.
So I heard Olya Hercules on a panel at the British Library last year.
Yeah.
And she was on a panel with Sally Abbey, and I have to apologise, forget the other chef that was on with her, but they were all asked whether if there was a dish they would like to reclaim. They were all from different nationalities,
okay.
or there was a word that you would like to reclaim. So, for example, Sally Abbey, who is obviously English, she's a chef. She said, "I want to reclaim the word chef because it's often associated with men." Blah blah blah. Olya, it was borscht because she says it was when Russia took, sort of going way back now, when it sort of invaded Ukraine and took over Ukraine and vast parts of the Soviet Union as it was then. They tried to standardise the offering, and each country got to have a standardised food, which for the Ukrainians was borscht. But as a consequence, now people think of borscht being Russian, and it's not. And she has explained to me latterly, there's huge varieties in borscht in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is a very big country. So I guess I'm curious to know, what Greek dish would you reclaim, or what Greek word would you like to reclaim?
Oh dear. Greek word. Ooh.
Or dish. We'll stick with dishes. We're food historians.
Dishes, yeah. This is. Oh yeah. I've got lots of time for lots of dishes. Let's start with the humble dip tzatziki.
Right.
Which for me is like a dip of rich yogurt with lots of garlic, extraordinary amounts of olive oil, lemon, and lots and lots of fresh dill. That's tzatziki for me. What we get here is some sad version, very stingy in olive oil and garlic, and probably a bit of mint, which is not, doesn't reflect the word at all for me. Moussaka as well, that's something that really is very complex about moussaka and how Greek it is, and all that stuff. But we don't use lamb mince. Like, lamb mince is not.
Really?
It's beef. It's beef or veal.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when I say lamb moussaka, I just wanna. I feel ill.
Like that mental note made there. Next time you come round for dinner, I won't be making you lamb moussaka then.
Yeah. And of course, whenever I see some place making Greek salad, especially in the winter, and it's just insipid, watery tomatoes, pitted, tasteless olives, some bad cheap olive oil, and some nondescript white cheese pretending to be fat on top. Like,
oh, I know.
Just,
it even makes my blood boil, and I'm not Greek. When you see feta style or halloumi style cheese, I know halloumi is Cypriot,
yeah.
But even so, it's like, what's wrong with the real stuff?
Yeah.
Why do we have to? I mean, okay, if it's vegan, I get that, but I don't. But
No.
I get that if it's an alternative product, I get that, but not when it's in the dairy section and it's being sold as cheese. But I'm like, okay, so if it isn't, why is that? Is that a PDO thing? Can't be a PDO thing, because I've seen feta.
It's just cheap stuff that they put like white cheese because it's cheaper than buying feta cheese, but it doesn't taste anything like that. So you substitute all the stuff that makes a great Greek salad and you eat in the summer, and you present with something that is just insipid and tasteless, and you call it Greek salad. It's like no, that's my modern. If we go back more historically, do you want to go back more historically? Should we go back to the past?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Malvasia wine or Malmsey wine.
Yeah.
So that has Greek origins. And the name refers to a place called Monevasia, which is a gorgeous medieval fortified town which still stands in southern Peloponnese, in the southern peninsula of Peloponnese. And initially, Malvasia is a family of grapes that is like ancient origin, I guess, from Crete. And because in the Renaissance and before, in the medieval period, a lot of Venetian merchants, they traded Malvasia wine from Crete to Venice and beyond. And they would stop in the Peloponnese because it's between Italy and Crete. And obviously they started having a lot of influence and colonies. They had Crete and Peloponnese and so on. So the name Malvasia started referring to this wine a lot. But it's not Venetian, it's or Italian. It's a Greek grape, Greek wine, Cretan. And we could go even further back and annoy my Italian friends and say that pizza and pasta, they're not really Italian, basically. They have ancient Greek ancestry as well.
That's controversial.
Yeah.
But in fairness, you've already said there is a huge Greek influence, is there not, in the southern part of Italy, particularly in Sicily?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
massive. So I think we can say it's a cross-contamination, pollination, and influence of both peoples and other tribes, because they weren't just the Latin people. There were many different tribes, and you had Etruscans and Samians and all the stuff, and Sicilians and Greeks, and so all these people, they made all this different stuff, flatbreads, pasta type of things, dried pasta type of things from wheat, and of course we can say it's not just Greek. But lasagna, the people say lasagna might be from an ancient Greek word called laganon, which is a type of flatbread. So there's this kind of thing that, they're not just Italian. Everybody has something similar.
Yeah. Well, indeed. And I think every nation in the world can, has that issue, doesn't
Indeed, yeah. But that's more like a tongue-in-cheek thing, yeah.
Yeah, but it's, I think, and that is the joy of cultures mixing, because you end up with such a diverse culinary repertoire. Although obviously sometimes in the midst of time, the origins of these things get forgotten about or overlooked, and sometimes bad things are done. But I for one whilst I'm not very pro empire and our history of colonialism, I'm very glad that we have the Indian diaspora here now, and that we have developed our own version of. You can't really call it Indian food. Curry is an English concept, really, isn't it? But for example, I'm totally with you on the Greek salad. I mean, you've said to me once, Greek salad doesn't even really exist, does it? It's called a Greek salad, but it's not really a Greek thing. It's been invented, isn't it, sort of more recently? Yeah,
like maybe 60s, 70s, like, for tourists, I suppose. Yeah, they call it Greek salad. Yeah, we used to call it probably the village salad. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
it's funny. Yeah. Yeah. I think it was invented because they want to charge more. So they're putting a slab of feta cheese on top of a village salad and call it Greek salads, so they can charge more in the restaurants.
Yeah.
Fair
enough.
Not very romantic story behind the salad.
They seldom are when you actually get to the bottom of these things. So but it's been fascinating chatting to you.
Great.
I think it's been when you look at the plays and you see how foreignness has been represented, but then actually the influence, even back then, the influence was rubbing off. And we are a hodgepodge, as John Miley said, of, different culinary trends and stuff. So, and I think that's a great thing.
We are. And that's how we are even more delicious. We make everything more delicious.
It's our delicious legacy.
It is. Tell us, where can we find your book? A fantastic book.
Well, it's available from all good booksellers and obviously from the Globe Direct. And if you go to the Globe Direct, you may even get a signed copy.
Oh, fantastic.
I popped in there a little while ago and signed many copies of the book. So, yeah, so you can buy it from, they have an online shop. You don't actually physically have to go to London, but you can buy it from the Globe Direct, or any local bookstore should be able to order it in. And obviously there's the online bookstores that if you so choose to buy it through them, then yes, they stock it too.
Brilliant. Sam, thank you so much for talking to me about your book and about Shakespeare and about all that stuff that makes our lives fascinating and interesting.
No, thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. This was the amazing Sam Bilton, food historian extraordinaire, author, podcaster, and a member of our Little Food Historians collective, Serve It Forth, together with Neil Battery and Alessandra Pino. You can find her podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Please subscribe because bi-weekly she is releasing an always fascinating discussion about some food ingredient or dish or tradition. You'll find her podcast and videos on YouTube as well, at Comfortably Hungry, all one word, and on Substack, comfortablyhungry.substack.com, where she shares recipes and extra bonus episodes of her podcast. Sam has released 4 books, including Much Ado About Cooking, which is the one about we talked about today, and the other 3 being First Cut Your Gingerbread, Fool's Gold, A History of British Saffron, and The Philosophy of Chocolate, this last one for the British Library. My recommendations for this week include the latest episode of Comfortably Hungry, The Meaning of Borscht, with Olia Hercules, where they discuss with chef, activist and author Olia Hercules about her family book Strong Roots, and also how borscht and water in general shaped Ukraine and its history. And so basically it complements really nicely my episode with Olia Hercules about Ukrainian food culture. So yeah, have a listen to that one. And also there is a little article on Secret London about UK soon will be home to the largest oyster reef in Europe, which is going to be in North Sea, and it's a part of a restoration project to help restore marine ecosystems and clean, of course, the water. I'll put a link in the show notes. And finally, my last recommendation is an article about ancient malt and ale, and making malt and malt sugars from cereals in the Paleolithic period. Again, I'll stick this in the show notes, and it's very relevant to my previous episode with Professor Tate Paulette about ancient Mesopotamian beer. But this one takes us even further to the past. Fascinating stuff. Thanks for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. If you want to support the podcast, please join our Patreon page, where from $3 a month, you can get the episodes early and ad-free, plus extra bonus material, video recipes, and other musings from me. Also, you can give one-off donations on Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/The Delicious Legacy Podcast. Your help means the world to me. It means I can concentrate more on producing these episodes even better than before, and finding some amazing guests for you. Thanks for listening. Join me again next week for another archaeogastronomical adventure. And remember, I love you more than a delicious crusty flaky pie filled with soft chunks of venison meat in a deep, rich, claret wine gravy. Bye!